The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Denver coffee shop where Noah Carter sat hunched over his laptop, scrolling through forums and social media posts that detailed increasingly disturbing encounters with something people called skinwalkers, a term he had only vaguely understood until 3 weeks ago when a viral video from rural Arizona showed blurry footage of what appeared to be a humanoid figure moving with impossible speed across a desert highway at night. Noah was 27 years old and had spent the last 5 years building a modest but respectable reputation as an independent documentarian, focusing on debunking urban legends and exposing the psychological mechanisms behind mass hysteria, having produced well-received pieces on Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest and supposed haunted locations in New England that attracted tourists willing to pay for manufactured scares. His approach had always been methodical and skeptical, grounded in the belief that rational explanation existed for every seemingly supernatural phenomenon if one was willing to dig deep enough past emotional reactions and cultural biases that clouded objective observation. The Skinwalker stories intrigued him precisely because they seemed to resist easy debunking, rooted as they were in genuine Navajo tradition rather than modern internet fabrication, and because the recent surge of reports came not just from anonymous online accounts, but from people willing to speak on camera about experiences that had left them genuinely traumatized in ways that seemed difficult to fake convincingly. He had spent weeks researching Navajo mythology, learning that skinwalkers were believed to be malevolent witches, capable of transforming into animals, and that speaking about them was considered dangerous within the culture, a taboo so serious that many Navajo people refused to discuss the topic even in academic contexts, which only deepened the mystery surrounding these entities and made Noah more determined to document whatever truth lay beneath the legends. His plan was to spend 3 weeks driving through Arizona and New Mexico, interviewing witnesses, visiting locations where encounters had been reported, and gathering footage that would form the foundation of his next documentary, which he intended to title Skinwalker: Separating Myth from Mass Hysteria. He had secured modest funding through his Patreon supporters, and had reached out to several contacts in indigenous communities, hoping to find someone who could provide cultural context and perhaps serve as guide through the complex terrain of Navajo spirituality and modern legend. Most of his inquiries had been met with silence or polite refusals, but 3 days ago he had received an email from Dr. Ayanna Redbird, an anthropologist with the University of Arizona who had Navajo heritage and who had expressed cautious willingness to meet with him to discuss his project, though her message had included stern warnings about respecting cultural boundaries and understanding that some knowledge was not meant to be shared with outsiders, regardless of their intentions. Noah had immediately accepted the meeting, sensing that Ayanna might be exactly the kind of credible voice his documentary needed to elevate it beyond typical paranormal entertainment into something more substantive that could attract attention from legitimate film festivals and streaming platforms. He had arranged to meet her in Flagstaff the following week, giving himself time to conduct preliminary interviews and scout locations before their conversation, wanting to arrive with enough knowledge to demonstrate that he was a serious researcher rather than exploitative outsider looking to profit from indigenous trauma and sacred traditions. As he packed his equipment into his aging Toyota 4Runner, Noah felt the familiar mix of excitement and nervous energy that always accompanied the start of a new project. But this time, there was something else underneath, a subtle unease he couldn't quite name that made him check his rearview mirror more frequently than usual as he began the long drive southwest toward Arizona under a sky that seemed somehow too vast and too empty as Denver's familiar skyline disappeared behind him. The landscape changed dramatically as Noah crossed into Arizona, the Green Mountains of Colorado giving way to red rock formations and endless stretches of desert punctuated by small towns that seemed to exist in defiance of the harsh environment surrounding them. He had scheduled his first interview in a tiny community outside Kayenta with a man named Thomas Begay, who had reported seeing something disturbing on his property 3 months ago, an encounter that had apparently left him so shaken that he had moved his family to stay with relatives in Albuquerque while he tried to process what had happened. Thomas had agreed to meet Noah at a diner in town, neutral ground, where he apparently felt safer discussing events he clearly did not want to relive, but felt compelled to share as warning to others. When Noah arrived at the diner, he found Thomas sitting alone in a corner booth, a man in his mid-40s with weathered features and hands that trembled slightly as he stirred his coffee, eyes that kept darting toward the windows as if expecting something to appear outside at any moment. After introductions and assurances that Thomas could stop the interview at any time if it became too uncomfortable, Noah turned on his camera and asked simply what had happened that night 3 months ago. Thomas was quiet for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and measured, as if he was carefully choosing each word. I was checking on my sheep around midnight because one of them had been sick, and I wanted to make sure she was okay. I had my flashlight and my dog was with me, old cattle dog who'd been with me for 12 years and who'd never been afraid of anything. We were walking toward the pen when he suddenly stopped. And I mean stopped completely, like he'd hit an invisible wall. The hair on his back went up, and he started making this sound I'd never heard before, not a growl or a whine, but something in between, something that sounded almost human. Then I saw it. Noah leaned forward, making sure his camera was capturing Thomas's expression as the man's hands gripped his coffee cup tightly enough that his knuckles went white. It was standing near the fence, maybe 50 yards away, and at first I thought it was a person, someone maybe trying to steal sheep, but the proportions were wrong. The arms were too long, hanging down past where knees should have been, and when it moved, it didn't walk like a person walks. It moved like something that was pretending to be human, but didn't quite understand how joints are supposed to work. My dog started backing up, still making that horrible sound, and then this thing, it turned its head toward us and I saw its eyes catch the flashlight beam. They reflected back like animal eyes do, but the color was wrong, kind of yellowish-orange, and they were too high up for any animal I know. And then it smiled. Thomas's voice cracked slightly on that last word, and he had to pause, taking several deep breaths before continuing. It smiled like it was enjoying my fear, and I could see teeth that were too sharp and too numerous to be human. That's when I ran. I grabbed my dog, and I ran back to the house, and I locked every door and window, and I sat with my rifle until sunrise, but I never heard anything else that night. In the morning I went out to check, and 3 of my sheep were dead, torn apart in ways that didn't make sense for coyotes or dogs or anything natural, and there were tracks in the dirt near the fence, tracks that started out looking like human footprints and then changed into something else, something with claws. Noah asked several follow-up questions, trying to establish details that might suggest rational explanations. But Thomas's account remained consistent, and his emotional response seemed genuine. The kind of deep-seated fear that was difficult to manufacture convincingly. After the interview, Noah sat in his vehicle reviewing the footage, feeling that same nameless unease creeping back, stronger now, as he looked out at the vast expanse of desert surrounding the small town, and wondered what might be watching from those empty spaces between civilization and wilderness. Noah's meeting with Dr. Ayana Redbird took place 5 days later at a small cafe in Flagstaff that specialized in indigenous-owned businesses and served traditional fry bread alongside modern coffee drinks, a space that seemed designed to bridge past and present in ways that made Noah acutely aware of his position as outsider entering cultural territory where his presence might not be entirely welcome. Ayana arrived precisely on time. a woman in her early 30s with sharp, intelligent eyes and bearing that suggested someone accustomed to navigating between academic world and traditional community with careful diplomacy. She had brought a leather journal filled with notes and sat across from Noah with posture that was simultaneously open and guarded, willing to share knowledge, but clearly establishing boundaries from the outset. After ordering coffee, she began speaking before Noah could launch into his prepared pitch about the documentary. "Mr. Carter, I agreed to meet with you because I've watched some of your previous work, and I appreciate that you at least attempt to approach subjects with some degree of respect and intellectual honesty, even if your conclusions tend towards skepticism that sometimes borders on dismissiveness of experiences that don't fit your rational framework. But I need to be very clear about something before we go any further. What you're investigating is not just folklore or legend that exists to be documented and explained away. Skinwalkers are real within Navajo spiritual understanding, and whether you personally believe in their existence in literal physical form is irrelevant to the fact that engaging with this subject carelessly can have serious consequences not just for you, but for the people and communities you're involving in your project. Her directness caught Noah slightly off guard, and he found himself listening more carefully than he had anticipated, recognizing that Ayana was not speaking from place of superstition, but from deep understanding of cultural and spiritual frameworks that operated according to different logic than his scientific materialism. He asked her to explain what she meant by real, genuinely curious now about how someone with her academic credentials reconciled traditional beliefs with modern anthropological training. Ayana took a moment before responding, clearly weighing how much to share with someone she had just met. In Navajo tradition, Skinwalkers are Yi Naldlushi, which roughly translates to, "with it, he goes on all fours." They are witches who have gained power by breaking the deepest taboos of our culture, including harming family members, and who use that dark power to transform into animal forms for malevolent purposes. The stories you've been collecting, the encounters people are reporting, these aren't new phenomena. They've been part of Navajo experience for as long as our oral histories extend. What is relatively new is people outside the culture taking interest and treating these accounts as material for entertainment, or as puzzles to be solved with cameras and rational explanations. She paused, studying Noah's reaction. "You want to know if I believe skinwalkers exist in the way your documentary equipment might capture them. I'll tell you what I know. I grew up hearing stories from elders who had encountered something that changed them fundamentally, who carried fear so deep that decades later they couldn't speak of it without their hands shaking, just like that man Thomas you interviewed. I've seen evidence that defies easy explanation, and I've learned that some questions are more dangerous to pursue than to leave unanswered. But I'm here because I also know that this story is going to be told with or without my input, and I'd rather be part of ensuring it's told with at least some respect for the culture it comes from." Their conversation continued for nearly 3 hours as Ayana provided context about Navajo spiritual beliefs, the role of harmony and balance in traditional worldview, and the ways that skinwalkers represented ultimate violation of that harmony through their choice to pursue power through corrupted means. She explained the complex protocols around discussing these entities, the protective measures that traditional people took seriously, and the reasons why many Navajo people became angry when outsiders treated skinwalker accounts as casual entertainment or subjects for paranormal investigation. Shows that sensationalized suffering without understanding deeper cultural implications. Noah found himself genuinely moved by her perspective and somewhat chastened by recognition that his approach, however well-intentioned, participated in pattern of extraction where indigenous knowledge and trauma became content for consumption by audiences who would never have to live with consequences of disrespecting powers they didn't believe in. He asked Ayana if she would be willing to accompany him to some of the locations where encounters had been reported, offering to compensate her time and to give her editorial input on how cultural elements were presented in final documentary. She considered the proposal carefully before agreeing with conditions. They would only visit locations where they had explicit permission from property owners. They would follow traditional protocols that she would teach him, and if at any point she felt they were proceeding unsafely or disrespectfully, they would stop immediately, regardless of what footage they had or hadn't captured. Noah agreed to her terms, feeling both relief at having her guidance and growing apprehension about what they might encounter once they began actively seeking out places where the boundary between mundane and inexplicable apparently grew thin. Their first location was an abandoned homestead about 40 miles from Window Rock, a place where multiple people had reported seeing something that watched them from the ruins of what had once been a family home before being mysteriously abandoned in the 1970s, under circumstances that local residents still didn't discuss openly. As they drove toward the location in Noah's Forerunner, with Ayana navigating using combination of GPS and her knowledge of back roads that didn't appear on digital maps, she taught him basic protection protocols from Navajo tradition, including prayers and the importance of maintaining respectful mindset that didn't challenge or mock what they might encounter. The landscape around them was stark and beautiful, red rock formations rising against impossibly blue sky, but as they got closer to their destination, Noah noticed that the beauty took on quality of emptiness that felt less peaceful and more like absence of something that should have been there, a silence that was too complete, even for desert environment. When they finally arrived at the homestead just as afternoon light was beginning to take on golden quality that photographers loved, but that also meant they had limited time before darkness fell, Noah immediately understood why this place featured in so many disturbing accounts. The ruins consisted of several collapsed structures partially reclaimed by desert, but there was something about the way shadows fell across the broken walls and the way wind moved through empty doorways that created sensation of being watched by presence that was patient and hungry and deeply hostile to human intrusion. Ayana became noticeably more tense as they approached, her earlier academic demeanor shifting into something more primal and alert, and she insisted they perform a brief ritual before proceeding, speaking words in Navajo that Noah didn't understand, but that somehow made the air around them feel slightly less oppressive, slightly safer though still far from comfortable. As Noah set up his camera equipment to document the location, he became increasingly aware of how vulnerable they were in this isolated place, with the sun sinking toward horizon and no other humans visible for miles in any direction, just endless desert stretching away toward distant mountains that looked purple in the fading light. Ayana was examining the ruins carefully, her anthropologist's eye cataloguing architectural details and her spiritual sensitivity attuned to currents Noah couldn't perceive but was beginning to suspect might be more real than his rational framework allowed him to acknowledge. They had been there perhaps 20 minutes when Noah's camera, which had been functioning perfectly all day, began experiencing interference, the image on the monitor flickering and distorting in ways that suggested electromagnetic disruption, though there was no obvious source for such interference in the middle of empty desert. He was checking connections and trying to troubleshoot the problem when Ayana suddenly gripped his arm with force that made him look up sharply to see her staring intently at something beyond the ruins. "We need to leave, now." Her voice was low but carried urgency that admitted no argument, and Noah found himself following her back toward the vehicle without question, some instinctive part of his brain recognizing that her alarm was based on perception of genuine danger, even if he couldn't see or understand what had triggered it. They were halfway back to the Forerunner when Noah made mistake of looking back toward the ruins and seeing what Ayana had seen, a figure standing in the doorway of one of the collapsed structures, a figure that was human-shaped, but wrong in ways his brain struggled to process, proportions subtly distorted, and posture suggesting something wearing human form rather than naturally inhabiting it. The thing was watching them, and even from 50 yards away, Noah could feel the weight of its attention, could sense malevolence so profound that his body reacted with primal fear that bypassed conscious thought and triggered every evolutionary instinct screaming at him to run. They made it to the vehicle, and Ayana drove them away with speed that sent dust billowing behind them as Noah kept his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, watching until the ruins disappeared from view, and even then not feeling entirely safe, not feeling like they had truly escaped whatever had been watching them from that abandoned homestead. Neither of them spoke for several miles, both processing what had happened in their own ways, until finally Noah broke the silence. "What was that? What did we just see?" His voice sounded strange to his own ears, higher pitched than normal and unsteady in ways he wasn't accustomed to hearing from himself. Ayana's hands were gripped tight on the steering wheel, and she didn't answer immediately, her jaw set in expression that suggested she was controlling her own fear through force of will. When she finally spoke, her words carried weight of someone sharing knowledge they wished they didn't possess. "That was exactly what I warned you about. That was a skinwalker, or something closely related to them. I've never seen one before today, despite growing up with the stories, despite knowing people who had encountered them. But I recognized it immediately because the wrongness is unmistakable once you've actually been in their presence. The way they move, the way they make you feel, it's not something that can be faked or explained away." She glanced at Noah, her expression mixing sympathy with something like anger. "Do you understand now why my people take this seriously? Why we have protocols and taboos? This isn't folklore, Noah. This is real danger that exists in spaces where most people never go, and that leaves alone those who respect it and know to stay away. But you wanted to investigate, you wanted your documentary, and now you've seen what happens when you go looking for things that are better left unfound." No. The accusation in her words stung, partly because Noah recognized it was at least partially deserved, and he spent the drive back to Flagstaff grappling with fundamental challenge to worldview he had held his entire adult life. The comfortable certainty that everything could be explained rationally if one just gathered enough data and applied sufficient skepticism to separate fact from superstition. But what he had seen at the homestead resisted that framework, existed in category his scientific materialism had no room for, and the fear he had felt was too visceral and too immediate to be dismissed as psychological suggestion or cultural conditioning. That night in his hotel room, he reviewed the footage from the camera before the interference had started, and was disturbed to discover that in several frames there appeared to be movement in the shadows that shouldn't have been possible given the angle of the sun and the absence of anything that could have cast those particular shadows, subtle visual anomalies that suggested something had been watching them even before they had become consciously aware of its presence. He sent the footage to Ayana with message asking if she thought they should continue with the documentary or if wisdom dictated abandoning project that was clearly more dangerous than he had anticipated when he had conceived it from safety of his Denver apartment, where skinwalkers were just interesting folklore, rather than encounters that left him checking his hotel room door lock multiple times before he could attempt sleep that came only fitfully and filled with dreams of figures watching. From darkness, with eyes that reflected light in colors that didn't exist in natural world, Ayana's response came the next morning. "We need to talk. There's something I didn't tell you yesterday because I wasn't sure, but after reviewing your footage, I think we have a serious problem." They met again at the same cafe, but this time the atmosphere was different, charged with tension that hadn't been present in their first meeting. Ayana had her laptop and pulled up the footage Noah had sent, zooming in on one of the frames where shadow anomalies were most obvious. "Look at this carefully. Do you see the pattern? Noah studied the image but couldn't identify what she was referring to until she traced it with her finger on the screen. The shadows formed something like symbols or glyphs that seemed almost deliberate in their arrangement, rather than random artifacts of light and angle. These marks, they're similar to certain symbols used in Navajo witchcraft traditions, markers that skinwalkers are said to leave as territorial claims or warnings. If this is what I think it is, that Homestead might have been deliberately attracting our attention, using reports of sightings to draw in people like you, who are curious but unprepared. And if that's true, then we may have already crossed a line that puts you specifically at risk, because you're the one actively seeking them out. You're the one who has made yourself visible to forces that most people instinctively avoid. The implications of what she was suggesting were deeply unsettling. The idea that he hadn't just been passively documenting phenomena, but had actively engaged with something that was now aware of his attention and might have reasons to reciprocate that interest in ways he very much did not want to experience. Noah asked what they should do, whether there were protective measures he should take or whether he should simply abandon the project and return to Denver, and Ayana's response was not reassuring. Traditional protections exist, but they work within framework of belief and cultural connection that you don't have access to as outsider. The best protection would be to stop actively seeking encounters, to leave Arizona and not return, to let this story go untold. But I suspect you're not going to do that. And honestly, even if you wanted to, I'm not sure they would let you leave now that you've seen them and they've seen you. The following week became a surreal nightmare that tested both Noah's sanity and his fundamental assumptions about reality as strange occurrences began accumulating with frequency that made coincidence increasingly implausible as explanation. His hotel room would show signs of disturbance even though he always locked the door, and security cameras never showed anyone entering. Objects moved from where he had left them and arranged in patterns that resembled the symbols Ayana had identified in his footage. His electronics continued malfunctioning in ways that technicians couldn't explain, and he began experiencing the sensation of being watched constantly, even in crowded public spaces. A prickling awareness of hostile attention that never quite resolved into concrete threat, but that wore at his nerves until he was sleeping only 2 or 3 hours per night, despite exhaustion that made his hands shake and his thoughts feel scattered and unfocused. Ayana stayed in contact, providing what support she could, while also consulting with traditional practitioners within her community who confirmed her fears that Noah had attracted attention of something dangerous, and that the fact it hadn't moved against him directly yet suggested it was observing him for reasons they could only speculate about, with possibilities ranging from simple curiosity about outsider who had violated boundaries to more sinister interpretations involving plans that required time to develop. The most disturbing incident occurred one night when Noah was reviewing footage in his hotel room and heard scratching sound coming from outside his window on the 4th floor, where there should have been nothing but empty air. And when he forced himself to look, he saw something crouched on the narrow ledge, something with vaguely human outline, but movement that was insectoid and alien, and it was looking directly at him with those same yellowish-orange eyes that reflected his room's light. He froze, unable to move or scream, as the thing remained motionless for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds before it dropped away from the ledge with speed that defied physics, disappearing into darkness below without sound of impact that should have accompanied 4-story fall. That encounter broke something in Noah's remaining skepticism, and he called Ayana in middle of night, voice shaking as he described what he had seen. She arrived within 20 minutes, despite the hour, and insisted he pack immediately and come stay at her family's home on the reservation, where traditional protections were stronger and where community could help guard against whatever was targeting him. Over his weak protests about not wanting to impose or create problems for her family, she made clear that this was no longer about his documentary or his research, but about ensuring he survived experience he had brought upon himself through combination of curiosity and arrogance, and that refusing help now would be both stupid and potentially fatal. The drive to the reservation took them deeper into territories where cell phone signals became intermittent and where darkness between towns felt oppressive in its completeness, broken only by their headlights cutting through emptiness that seemed to press against the windows as if testing for weakness. Ayana explained as they drove that her grandmother, who was respected elder and practitioner of traditional medicine, had agreed to perform ceremony for protection, but that success would depend partly on Noah's willingness to surrender his need to understand rationally and simply accept help being offered without demanding explanations that his cultural framework couldn't accommodate. "You wanted to document the darkest Skinwalker stories," Ayana said with bitterness that carried weight of witnessed consequences. "Congratulations, you've become one of them. The question now is whether your story ends with you learning respect for forces you don't understand, or whether it ends the way too many of these stories end, with someone who pushed too far and paid price that can't be filmed or explained away." Okay. The ceremony performed by Ayana's grandmother the next evening was unlike anything Noah had experienced. Conducted in Navajo with prayers and ritual actions that seemed to alter the atmosphere of the room in ways that bypassed his rational mind and connected with something deeper, some part of human consciousness that recognized sacred regardless of cultural context or belief systems. The old woman was frail physically, but emanated presence that made it clear she was authority not to be questioned. And when she looked at Noah, it felt like she was seeing not just his surface, but everything beneath, weighing his intentions and his character with gaze that missed nothing. She spoke to him briefly in English, her accent thick but her words clear. "You have been marked. The darkness has seen you and found you interesting. I can provide some protection, enough that they may lose interest if you are wise, and leave this place and do not return. Do not speak of what you have learned. Do not try to share these stories with world that should not know them. But if you continue to pursue this knowledge, if you try to make your film and tell these tales, the protection will not hold, and what happens next will be your responsibility alone." Noah thanked her and promised he would heed her warning, genuinely meaning it in that moment, surrounded by power of tradition and facing consequences of his actions. But in quieter moments, over following days, he found himself struggling with decision about whether to truly abandon project he had invested so much time and energy into, or whether to find some way to tell story that might satisfy both his journalistic instincts and the obligations he now recognized. He had to respect cultural boundaries and spiritual realities he could no longer deny existed, even if he couldn't fully explain them. Ayana watched his internal conflict with sympathy, mixed with frustration, knowing that addiction to curiosity and drive to document were not easily overcome even by fear. But she also made clear that if he chose to continue, she would not be able to help him further, that her responsibility to her community and to the traditions she had been raised with superseded any friendship they had developed through this harrowing experience. In the end, Noah made a decision that surprised even himself. He would keep the footage and the interviews he had gathered, but he would not make the documentary he had originally planned, would not package these experiences into entertainment for audiences who had not earned right to access knowledge that came with such heavy responsibilities and risks. Instead, he wrote a different kind of piece, an essay that focused on his own transformation from skeptic to someone who had learned humility in face of realities that transcended his ability to explain, an account that respected boundaries Ayana and her grandmother had taught him to recognize, while still honoring truth of what he had experienced, even if that truth resisted the kind of documentary proof he had originally sought. The essay was published by a small literary magazine and reached perhaps a few thousand readers, most of whom probably dismissed it as creative non-fiction rather than genuine testimony. But that limited reach felt appropriate somehow, felt like the story had found its right audience among those who were prepared to receive it with proper respect, rather than being broadcast to millions who would consume it as mere entertainment. Noah returned to Denver changed in ways he was still processing, his certainty about nature of reality permanently shaken, and his relationship to indigenous cultures fundamentally altered by recognition that there existed forms of knowledge and experience that were not his to claim or commodify regardless of his intentions. He thought often of that figure on the hotel window ledge, of the homestead ruins where something ancient and hostile still waited, of Ayana's words about some stories being too dangerous to tell, and he understood finally that the darkest Skinwalker stories were not the ones that could be filmed or shared, but the ones that lived in silence, carried by those who knew better than to speak them aloud, and that the true terror was not in the encounters themselves, but in the recognition that human understanding had limits that were dangerous to transgress, boundaries that existed for reasons older and wiser than any documentary could ever capture.